It all started with a business trip. Just a month ago, I couldn't have imagined that I'd find myself in a remote corner of the Carpathians, where it feels like civilization has been frozen in time. As a gas exploration specialist, I'm used to expeditions to various places, but what awaited me here defied all logic. Our mission was to survey a mountainous region in southwestern Ukraine, near the village of Mavka. There were 4 of us traveling together. Me, 2 Ukrainian geologists, Andriy and Oleg, and our driver, Mykola. The company provided us with an old SUV that barely managed the winding mountain roads. Mavka greeted us with an unwelcoming chill. The small village, nestled at the foot of the mountains, seemed almost asleep. Wooden houses with shingled roofs, narrow streets where cars could barely pass, and wisps of smoke rising from behind the homes. Life here had a different rhythm, slow, almost frozen. We checked into a small hotel that Mykola had arranged in advance. The building was old but sturdy, with carved window frames and the sharp scent of wood and herbs inside. At the door, we were met by the owner, an elderly man with a thick mustache and a stern expression.
Good afternoon.
This is Stepan.
Mykola explained with a nod in his direction.
He knows everyone here and will help if needed.
Stepan's gaze lingered on us, and he said something in Ukrainian, clearly addressing me.
He's asking where you're from.
Mykola translated. I'm from England, I replied. Stepan nodded at my answer, but his expression grew even more cautious. After a brief exchange, with Mykola acting as our interpreter, Stepan led us inside. The interior was simple, yet cozy. Wooden walls, shelves adorned with dried herbs, and old framed photographs. Stepan pulled out a ring of keys and handed one to each of us. I was given a room at the end of the corridor. Just as we were about to head upstairs, Stepan stopped me with a gesture. After a moment's pause, he handed me a small bundle.
He says to take this. You might need it.
Mykola translated. I unwrapped the bundle and found a peculiar item inside. A roughly cast iron amulet tied with bundles of dried garlic and wormwood. Is this some kind of charm? I asked, smirking. Mykola translated my question, and Stepan nodded gravely. He said something quickly, his tone tense, and Mykola added,
Stepan says that in spring it's better to carry something like this in the forest. Different spirits roam here.
Spirits? I repeated, raising an eyebrow skeptically. Thanks, but I'm a geologist, not a ghost hunter. Mykola translated my reply, but Stepan didn't smile. Instead, he quietly said a few more words before turning and heading into another room.
He says it's your choice, but don't complain later.
Mykola translated with a smirk. I left the amulet on the counter and headed upstairs to my room. That evening, I couldn't seem to relax. Stepan's words, his strange demeanor, and his insistence stuck in my mind. I'd met people who believed in myths before, but this felt different. There was an edge of genuine concern in his voice, as though he knew something he wasn't willing to share. When I finally lay down, the shadows of the trees outside my window seemed longer than usual. Our first days in the Carpathians passed peacefully, though with a slight undercurrent of tension. Andriy and Oleg, my Ukrainian colleagues, navigated the local trails with confidence, while I relied more on my equipment. The forest was dense, almost impenetrable, covered in moss and ferns, and it felt ancient, older than time itself. We surveyed nearby areas, took soil samples, and inspected potential drilling sites. Everything went smoothly, but one thing stood out. Oleg and Andriy absolutely refused to go deeper into the forest.
There's no point in going there.
Oleg said one day when I suggested heading further into the denser section, where the trees blocked out most of the sunlight. Why not? I asked.
This forest, it's not like others.
Andriy replied evasively. Nonsense, I muttered under my breath, but I noticed how relieved they both seemed when we returned to the open areas. That evening, over dinner at the hotel, I decided to press the issue and find out why they avoided those parts of the forest. Andriy, Oleg, what's wrong with this forest? I asked. They exchanged glances.
Legends?
Oleg said simply.
The locals believe spirits live there. Mavka.
Mavka? I repeated, recalling that I had read something about it in a guidebook. Isn't that like a water nymph or something? Andriy nodded.
But it's not just stories. People have disappeared there. The forest takes them. We don't go in, and you shouldn't either.
I smirked. I respected folklore, of course, but believing in it was a step too far for me. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Rain softly tapped against the roof and tree branches rustled outside the window. Just as I was drifting off, a sound startled me awake. A voice. It sounded as though someone was calling me. At first it was faint, barely audible, but then it grew slightly louder.
Hey, over here.
I sat up in bed, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe one of my colleagues had come back late. But when I looked out the window, I saw only deep darkness and the faint outlines of trees. The sound didn't come again. The next day, I decided to explore the forest alone. Andrei and Oleg stayed near the car, refusing to join me. I walked further along the trail until I reached its edge. The forest was utterly silent, broken only occasionally by the rustle of birds or the creak of branches. That's when I saw it, an old, torn backpack lying at the base of a massive oak tree. It looked like it had been there for years. Curiosity outweighed caution. I approached and opened it. Inside were tattered maps, a piece of hardened bread, an amulet similar to the one Stepan had offered, and a book with a faded cover. The title page was in Ukrainian, but as I flipped through it, I realized it was a collection of local myths. Perfect for killing time in the evenings, I thought, and slipped the book into my backpack. When I returned to the car, Oleg gave me a look as though I had brought something forbidden out of the forest.
What's that?
He asked, nodding toward the book. Just some reading material, I replied.
You shouldn't take anything from the forest.
He said seriously. I smirked again, but deep down, something about his words struck a nerve. That night, I started reading the book. The pages were old, and the text was slightly faded. I didn't know Ukrainian, but modern technology can work wonders. Pulling my phone out of my backpack, I opened a translation app. Shining a flashlight on the page, I began photographing the text and feeding it into the app. It was slow and awkward, but it worked. Some words and phrases lost meaning due to the archaic language, but I could grasp the general context. The further I read, the more I felt an eerie sensation, as if each word in the book came alive in the darkness outside my room. The book detailed Mavkas, their habits, places they haunted, and their peculiar traits. One description stood out to me. Mavkas appear in spring, as the grass begins to grow. They lure with their voices, taking on the appearance of someone familiar or calling out as if they know your name. The words lingered in my mind, and I recalled the voice I'd heard the night before. A chill ran down my spine. On the third day, I decided to head back into the forest for measurements. As before, Andrei and Oleg refused to join me.
Let us know if you find anything.
Oleg said, settling onto the car's hood. Andrei just nodded, avoiding eye contact with me. Leaving them at the forest's edge, I ventured deeper, checking my equipment and marking points on the map. The forest felt different. There were no rustling animals, no bird song, not even the usual sound of the wind. Everything was too quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I followed a winding trail until something caught my attention. Movement in the distance. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. A woman was standing there. She looked as though she belonged to another world. Tall and slender, with long green hair that cascaded in soft waves down to her waist. Her skin was pale, almost glowing in the dim light of the forest, yet it didn't appear sickly. She wore a light pastel white dress that flowed around her body like morning mist. The fabric seemed impossibly thin, barely perceptible, yet it perfectly accentuated her figure. She was so breathtakingly beautiful that, for a few moments, I completely forgot where I was. I just stood there, mesmerized, staring at her. "Hey," I called out, taking a step toward her. But as soon as I moved closer, she vanished. She didn't run or hide. She simply disappeared, as if dissolving into thin air. I stopped in my tracks, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it a trick of the light? My imagination? A sense of unease began to creep in. I looked around, hoping to find some trace of her, but the ground was undisturbed. Nothing. I decided to keep moving, though the feeling of being watched clung to me like a shadow. Hours passed, though I hadn't realized how quickly time was slipping away. The forest, which had seemed so quiet at first, now felt alive. Rustling noises came from all directions, branches cracked somewhere nearby, and every so often I thought I heard faint echoes of footsteps. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly evening. "Damn," I muttered. I'd promised to be back before sunset. Quickening my pace, I began searching for the way back. The forest, which had seemed straightforward in the morning, now felt like a labyrinth. The trees all looked the same. The trail seemed to vanish, and I was certain I hadn't seen this part of the woods before. And then I saw it. A small silver cross hung on the branch of a nearby tree. It was tarnished, with a darkened sheen, and looked oddly out of place. I froze. It was strange. Who could have left it here? Walking closer, I carefully took the cross from the branch. It had delicate engravings, but no inscriptions. As I held it, the weight of the day seemed to lift slightly, and the fear that had been gnawing at me began to fade. I slipped the cross into my jacket pocket and hurried on. By the time I emerged from the forest, the sun was almost gone. Andriy and Oleg were waiting by the car.
Where have you been so long?
Oleg asked.
We thought you'd gotten lost.
Just got a bit carried away, I replied, trying to brush it off. But even to my own ears, my voice sounded unconvincing. They didn't press me further, but as we drove back to the hotel, I caught myself constantly glancing over my shoulder. It felt as if something was watching us from the shadowed trees. That night, my sleep was restless. Images kept flashing through my mind. Green hair, glowing eyes, the cross. By morning, when I checked the time, I realized something unsettling. The hours I'd spent in the forest didn't add up. It felt as though I'd been there much longer than a few hours. The next day, we set out to another site, but I couldn't stop thinking about the woman I'd seen in the forest. My curiosity had turned into an obsession, and I resolved to learn more. That evening, over dinner at the hotel, I struck up a conversation with a local guide who had been hired to accompany us the following week. His name was Ivan, and he was friendly, though a little superstitious. Fortunately, Ivan spoke decent English, which made our conversation much easier. "Ivan, what do you know about Mavkas?" I asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. Ivan raised his eyebrows, but the smile quickly faded from his face.
"Why are you asking?"
He replied, his voice suddenly serious. "I just heard it's a local legend. Thought I'd learn more about it." He set his fork down and leaned in closer.
"It's not just legends,"
he said quietly.
"A lot of people here believe in them, and not without reason."
I leaned in too, intrigued by his tone. "Tell me more." Ivan sighed as if debating whether or not to continue.
Mavkas are the souls of young women who died tragically and never found peace. Some say it's because of unrequited love, others say they were murdered. They dwell in forests and mountains, beautiful, alluring, but dangerous.
He paused, choosing his words carefully.
If you hear their voice or see one, it's best not to approach. They can lure you, make you lose track of time, and sometimes...
"Sometimes what?" I asked.
Sometimes they don't let you go.
I studied Ivan's face, trying to gauge how serious he was. "And what about protection?" I asked, recalling the strange mentions in the book I'd found. He nodded.
There are old methods: iron, garlic, wormwood. These things keep them away. People here often wear iron charms. But if you meet a Mavka, it's best to leave as quickly as you can.
Later that night, I opened the book I'd found in the forest once again. Flipping through its pages, I came across a chapter about Mavkas. The translated text read, "Mavkas cast no shadows and have no reflections. Their backs are transparent, revealing a heart that does not beat. If a man encounters a Mavka, she will deceive him with her beauty and voice, leading him astray in the forest. However, iron, garlic, and wormwood can protect against their enchantments." As I read on, another curious detail caught my eye. Mavkas can lure not only through their voices but also through visions. They awaken memories and hidden desires to ensnare the mind and will. I closed the book, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Ivan might have been right. Whatever this was, I could no longer dismiss it as mere folklore. On the 5th day of our work in the Carpathians, something happened that changed everything. It began like any other day, but ended in uncertainty and fear. Once again, Oleg, Andriy, and I ventured into the forest for our usual measurements. This time, we were joined by another team member, Mark, a young, energetic guy who'd come from the central office in The Hague. Full of enthusiasm, he tried to lighten the mood with jokes from the very start.
"Well, colleagues, another day surrounded by fairy tales and superstitions. Maybe today we'll find Baba Yaga,"
Mark said with a grin, adjusting his backpack. Oleg snorted, Andriy just shook his head, and I didn't reply. My attention was entirely focused on the forest around us. After the recent events, I no longer felt at ease here. We split up to speed up the work. I stayed with Oleg, while Mark and Andre headed in another direction. We agreed to meet back at the car in 3 hours. From the very start, something felt off. The forest was even quieter than before, if that was even possible. Even Ole, who was usually talkative, seemed tense and spoke very little. When we returned to the car, Andre was already waiting for us. His face was tight with worry, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. "Where's Mark?" I asked. Andre spread his hands.
We were walking together, but halfway through, he said he wanted to check something by the river. I waited for him for about 10 minutes, then called out, but he didn't answer.
"Did you go after him?" Ole frowned.
Of course I did,
Andre replied sharply.
but he wasn't there. All I found was his backpack.
As he spoke, Andre lifted Mark's backpack, which was sitting on the ground next to the car. We immediately decided to head to the river to search for Mark. Andre led us to the spot where they had parted ways. When we reached the river, the first thing that caught my eye was Mark's boots, neatly placed at the water's edge. His jacket lay nearby on the ground.
Why would he leave all this here?
Ola asked quietly. I stayed silent, a growing sense of unease churning inside me. The place felt strange. The air here was cooler than in the rest of the forest, and there was a damp smell, even though the river was shallow. We searched the surrounding area, calling out for him, shouting his name, but there was no response. The only sound was the slow, steady flow of the water, as if nothing unusual had happened.
This is impossible.
Andre muttered, looking bewildered. He couldn't have just vanished. Ole, trying to keep his composure, suggested we head back to the village and notify the police. On the way back, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had been with me all morning. The image of Mark's boots by the river kept flashing in my mind. And another image, the woman I had seen a few days ago. Her glowing skin, her light dress, her green hair. Could it all be connected? I remembered Ivan's story about Mavkas. They lure people into the forest, make them lose their way, and take them. Could what I had seen be real and not just a trick of the mind? By evening, we had reported the incident to the local police. 2 officers came to the hotel to take our statements, listening carefully, though their expressions betrayed skepticism. "He probably just got lost," one of them said. "We'll begin searching in the morning." Their reassurances did little to calm us. I spent that night lying awake in bed, unable to sleep, rereading the mythology book. Mavkas can lure people to the water, where they become lost, as if under a spell. Many who encounter a Mavka never return. This phrase echoed in my mind over and over. The next morning, the search for Mark began. Several people, including us, combed through the forest, but it was as though he had vanished. No one dared to say the word Mavka aloud, but I noticed the locals crossing themselves when passing certain areas of the forest. While the rational part of my mind tried to convince me it was all just coincidence, a deeper part of me already knew the truth. What we encountered here was more than just a legend. After Mark's disappearance, the forest became a place I wished to avoid, yet couldn't. A strange sensation, almost like a call, began haunting me from the moment I woke up. It was elusive but persistent, like a faint voice beckoning from afar. At first, I dismissed it as stress and sleep deprivation, but by evening, the feeling had become unbearable. When we returned to the hotel, I tried to distract myself, but the strange call seemed to burrow deeper into my thoughts. After dinner, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight and pulling on my jacket, I told my colleagues I was going out for some air. No one questioned me. Everyone was too on edge after what happened to Mark. I headed toward the forest, driven by instinct. The night was dark and unnervingly quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. At first, I followed a path, but soon my legs seemed to move of their own accord, guiding me deeper into the woods. I walked without thought, as though something gentle yet insistent was urging me forward. With every step, the feeling intensified. The call became audible, a voice, feminine and melodic, almost like a song.
Come.
The voice whispered from somewhere ahead. I stopped, a shiver running down my spine. "Who's there?" I shouted, but my voice sounded muffled, as though the forest itself was swallowing the sound. The only reply was the sudden rise of a breeze, rustling the trees, which seemed to murmur something incomprehensible. And then I saw her. She stood between the trees, not far away, shrouded in utter stillness. Her silhouette was perfectly visible in the moonlight. It was the same woman I had seen a few days ago. I stared at her, captivated by her presence. Her long, flowing hair, like strands of seaweed, spilled over her shoulders, glinting with a greenish hue under the moonlight. Her dress, light and semi-transparent, clung to her figure, swaying as though it were alive. She looked like a creature out of a fairy tale, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. She turned to face me, her gaze soft yet beckoning, and I felt my will begin to slip away.
Come to me.
She whispered, her voice washing over me in a warm wave, erasing fear and doubt. I stepped forward, as though my body no longer obeyed my own commands. Her figure glided between the trees, and without even realizing it, I followed. We approached the river. The water was dark and still, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. She stopped at the riverbank and, glancing back slightly, beckoned me with her finger.
Come here?
She said, her voice soft yet insistent, like music that seeps directly into your mind. I took another step forward, now standing at the very edge of the water. Something inside me screamed that this was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. And then, as she began to turn her back to me, I saw it. Her silhouette in the moonlight was perfect, but her back was transparent, like glass. Through it, I could see the inside of her. Delicate veins, a motionless heart, and glowing organs pulsing with a slow, alien rhythm. A chill ran down my spine. That sight shattered the protective cocoon of her hypnosis, and I suddenly realized just how unnatural this all was. At that moment, I remembered the small silver cross in my pocket. Gripping it tightly in my hand became my salvation. The forest around me seemed to tremble, and the Mavka's voice lost its sweetness, turning into a distant wail. Her figure, mesmerizing just a second ago, now appeared unnatural, almost grotesque. I stepped back, then again, never taking my eyes off her face, which now bore an expression of rage.
You can't leave.
She whispered, her voice almost pleading, but I knew that if I stopped, it would all be over. Summoning every ounce of willpower, I turned and ran, breaking branches and stumbling over roots. Her voice grew fainter, fading into the distance until it disappeared completely, leaving me alone in the cold night. When I finally emerged from the forest, my legs were shaking, and my heart was pounding wildly. Only then did I realize how close I had come to never leaving that forest. Whatever that was, it was not human. And now I was certain that the legends about Mavkas were far from fiction. Back at the hotel, I entered my room, slammed the door shut, and pressed my back against it, as if that could protect me from whatever was still out there in the forest. My heart raced, and my thoughts were a tangled mess. I tossed my jacket onto the bed and looked at the small cross in my hand. It was the very thing that, I now understood, had saved my life. I sank into a chair and tried to make sense of what had happened. The forest, the woman, her voice, it was all too real to be a dream. Later that night, I tried talking to Oleg. Cautiously, I described what I had seen without naming it outright. Oleg, I began, choosing my words carefully. You've heard those stories about Mavkas, right? He froze, staring at me, then nodded. What if they're not just legends? He chuckled, but I saw the unease in his eyes.
Did you see something?
I don't know. I hesitated. Something strange happened. Oleg was silent for a long moment before sighing.
You know,
He said finally.
it's better not to talk about that here. Don't draw any unwanted attention.
His words only deepened my fears. Even he, a man who had lived in these parts his entire life, was afraid to speak about it openly. The night was restless. I lay in the darkness, listening to every sound outside the window, but nothing unusual happened. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the forest, the moonlight, and her, standing by the riverbank, staring at me with those eyes that were too deep to endure. Her voice echoed just as I woke up in a cold sweat.
You will come back.
The next morning, I woke up feeling as though the night had never ended. My body ached as if I had run a marathon, and my head spun with every movement. Staring at my reflection in the dim bathroom mirror, I noticed how pale I had become. Dark circles rimmed my eyes, as if I hadn't slept in days. I blamed it all on stress and lack of rest, but a gnawing feeling inside told me it was something more. At breakfast, my colleagues noticed how unwell I looked.
Are you okay?
Oleg asked, handing me a cup of strong coffee. Just tired, I muttered, avoiding his gaze. But I knew it wasn't true. With every passing hour, the weakness grew worse. By noon, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the measuring equipment. Oleg insisted we return to the hotel early.
You're not well. Get some rest.
He said. I nodded, realizing I was in no state to work. Back at the hotel, I could barely stand. The heaviness in my chest and the growing weakness were relentless. All I wanted was to find answers. Stepan was sitting at the reception desk, flipping through a worn newspaper. I approached him, this time unwilling to rely on gestures or simple words. Oleg, I need you to translate, I said, glancing around to find my colleague. Oleg was sitting in the corner, scrolling through his phone. He looked up and walked over.
What's going on?
He asked. Translate for me. This is important. As I began recounting what had happened in the forest, Stepan's face grew increasingly serious. When I mentioned the woman with green hair and the transparent back, he froze, then crossed himself.
You met a Mavka,
He said quietly. I turned to Oleg. What did he say?
He says you encountered a Mavka. That's bad. Very bad.
Oleg translated. Stepan said something quickly, looking at me with a mix of worry and urgency. He sighed, gesturing for me to follow him.
He says there's a way to help you, but we need to act fast.
Oleg explained. We followed Stem to a small storage room near the kitchen. Inside, he began rummaging through his supplies, pulling out bundles of herbs and other odd items. Finally, he retrieved a bundle of dried wormwood, several heads of garlic, and an old metal bowl tarnished with age.
This will help,
He said, handing everything to me. What is this? I asked, looking at the herbs and garlic.
cleansing. She sucks the life out of you, but this will stop her if you do it right.
He explained.
He says it's for cleansing.
Oleg translated.
The Mavka drains your life force, but this ritual can stop her.
I listened carefully, trying to absorb every word. Stepan continued with instructions. Burn the wormwood, smoke yourself with the fumes, and always keep the garlic with you as protection. And most importantly, Stepan added, raising a finger, don't go back to the forest. That night, I followed the instructions, though I felt foolish sitting in my room with a smoldering bowl and a bundle of garlic in my hands. The wormwood burned slowly, filling the air with thick, bitter smoke. To my surprise, it actually worked. The heaviness in my chest began to lift, my head cleared, and for the first time in a long while, I felt relief. But with that relief came the understanding that this was only temporary. The forest continued to call to me, like a dark shadow lingering at the edge of my consciousness. I knew that this nightmare was far from over. After performing the cleansing ritual, the days dragged on slowly and heavily. Time seemed to stretch, and I could feel the pressure of the forest outside my window never letting up. It watched me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything happening wasn't just a coincidence. I realized that I could no longer be a passive observer. I needed answers, and they came, as if on their own, when I picked up the mythology book again. The book was worn by time, its pages yellowed, the cover torn. But its contents, strangely enough, became clearer to me, despite my limited knowledge of the local languages. Each paragraph seemed to speak to me, guiding me along the right path. One of my major discoveries was an old note hidden at the back of the book. The text was written clear but old-fashioned handwriting, as if someone had been determined to leave a warning for future generations. Mavkas are not just a myth. They are the souls of those who once perished, whose bodies remain in this world, trapped in eternal sorrow. These souls cannot find peace until they find their lover or the one who caused their death. Mavkas, when they fully manifest, become visible in the spring, when the grass regrows and the earth begins to warm. It is only during this time that they have a chance at liberation. However, to calm a Mavka's soul, you must find her remains. Yes, the remains, and perform a ritual that will complete the cycle. The cleansing ritual must include an iron amulet, as well as the prayer written in this note. This will return her soul to peace. But what is important to remember is that in the spring, their souls are especially vulnerable, but during this period, they can also be extremely dangerous. Be careful. To avoid becoming a victim, you need to find the body, perform the ritual, and calm the soul. I froze as I read these words. Now everything was clear. Everything that had happened to us in the forest was no coincidence. Mavkas were not just ancient legends. They were real creatures, and they didn't simply disappear. There was truth in their story, and that truth terrified me. But the question remained, where to find the remains, where to search for the body of the dead Mavka. I flipped through the book in search of further instructions, but found nothing more. Then I took the amulet I had found in the backpack and remembered what Stepan had told me, an iron amulet. It was like a key phrase that could help me, but I didn't understand how exactly. The book spoke of how Mavkas were especially vulnerable in spring when the grass was fresh and green. That moment seemed to be the most suitable time to find and help their souls. But at the same time, it was in spring that they became more dangerous than ever. It could be related to spring being a time of rebirth. And for souls like those of the Mavkas, this could mean an even greater struggle between light and shadow, between the chance to find peace and the desire to remain in this world. I glanced at the window again, where the spring sun shone. This knowledge didn't bring me relief, it only increased my fear. However, I knew I had to act if I didn't want to become part of this legend. The question was not how to protect myself, but how to find a way to stop all of this. I could no longer wait. Everything I had experienced in these days was pulling me back into the forest, back to where it all began. I felt that I could no longer be a mere observer. My body and mind were desperately craving an answer, and perhaps only there, among the dark trees, could I find it. And if I succeeded in finding her remains, if I managed to complete this terrible ritual, then maybe, just maybe, I could finally rid myself of the feeling that this would never end. I spent the whole morning in uneasy thoughts, and by midday, I had made up my mind. I grabbed a small shovel and left the hotel alone, not telling anyone where I was going. Stepan, of course, tried to talk me out of it, but his words didn't reach me. There was something unsettling in his gaze, as if he knew I wouldn't return the same. But I couldn't stop. My path led me back into the forest. This time, everything was different. It wasn't as dark, not as sinister. Soft sunbeams broke through the tree canopies, creating whimsical light spots on the ground. But I knew it was just an illusion. There was no light in this forest. It only hides, waiting to catch you in its snare. My steps were determined, and my intuition led me exactly to the place where I had first seen her. The girl with the green hair and piercing eyes. I trusted my feeling that this was the spot where I would find what I was searching for. Suddenly, an old stump appeared in front of me, covered in moss, just as I remembered. Everything here was the same as when I stood there, fighting the temptation. I looked around. Nothing had changed. At that moment, my heart stopped, and my mind began to race with frantic speed. I leaned down and began to dig into the earth, slowly at first, but then faster, with desperate force. Stones, roots, wet earth, all of it slipped from my hands. I couldn't believe I hadn't found what I was looking for yet, but I kept digging. My breathing became heavier, my fingers ached, but I felt I needed to continue, that I was almost there. And then, after some time, I felt something hard brush against my hand. I held my breath and carefully pulled it from the ground. The dark, damp earth slid away, and what emerged was bones. Human bones. In front of me, at the very center of the pit, lay the remains. Oh God, it was a body. The body of that very girl. I couldn't believe my eyes. Before me were the remains. The bones were broken, and the clothing, something resembling a torn dress, a fabric not of this world. I carefully, almost afraid to touch them, examined the skeleton. Her teeth were bared, as though she who had died so many years ago had stayed here, in this forest, helpless and alone. At that moment, I realized that here, among these bones, was not just a soul, not just a myth. It was something real, unimaginably terrifying, woven into this land. I knew that if I failed to complete the ritual and free her soul, she would remain here forever. And then she would take me, as she had taken so many before me. With my heart pounding, I took the iron amulet I had brought with me and closed my eyes, ready to say the prayer. The words from the book that I had learned flashed through my mind. I felt as though the whole forest held its breath, the darkness around me thickening. The words in a language I barely understood came out slowly, but I had to do it. I had to finish it, to free her and free myself. I spoke the final words of the prayer, and in that instant, something changed. A strange glow appeared around me, as if the very air had lightened. The earth beneath my nails, soft and damp, no longer felt like earth. Everything around me seemed to shudder, and I felt something leave. The dark cloud dissipated. My breath became easier. And when everything fell silent, I opened my eyes. The girl was standing beside me, but her form was different now. Her pale skin no longer glowed, and her face had become peaceful, as if it had found rest. I stood there, frozen. It was over. Everything that could have been had ended. But I knew that perhaps this meeting, this struggle, was not yet finished. I stood in silence, the image of what had just happened still pulsing before my eyes. I couldn't believe what was unfolding. Everything I had experienced seemed to have just ended, but I couldn't move. My legs felt as if they were rooted to the ground, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and sensations. All I knew for certain was that I had done it. I didn't know how, but I had done it. The girl stood before me, completely different from how I had seen her in the forest. That horrible trance, that distortion that turned her into a monster, was gone. Now she was simply a human, though not entirely human. Her face showed no signs of fear or pain. It was softened only by calmness and gratitude. Her large eyes, once filled with wild longing and loneliness, now glowed with a gentle light. She looked at me with an incredible tenderness, as if she knew that, at this moment, I had become part of her liberation. Her lips trembled into a slight smile. It was the kind of smile as if she were feeling, for the first time, that she could smile without pain. She didn't speak much. Her eyes had already said everything, but she whispered a few quiet phrases that I barely caught.
Thank you, you freed me.
Her voice was soft and warm, like a spring breeze, but there was still an invisible pain in it, an unacknowledged sadness, as if she had searched for a way out of her tragedy for so long and had finally found it. I stood motionless, not knowing how to react, what to say. In that moment, words weren't necessary. I watched as her face, not without a hint of sadness, slowly transformed, as if fog lifting at dawn. Her body began to fade, like dissipating mist, and I felt her disappearing. Her presence lingered in the air. I breathed easily now, no longer burdened by the weight that had pressed on me all this time. A strange but pleasant fragrance of flowers, which I couldn't quite describe, suddenly filled the space around me. A light breeze touched my face, and in its gusts, I felt warmth. Warmth I had so desperately missed here in this forest. And then she was gone, but her presence remained, like the memory of something deeply precious and important. Only those wondrous flowers remained, unfamiliar to me, yet so alive and real, as though they had sprung from nature itself. All I could do was stand still, feeling how the soul I had freed had finally found peace. The wind died down, and the forest was again filled with silence. But this silence was no longer suffocating. The forest now seemed simply like a forest, alive and peaceful, as it once was. All that remained were traces of her presence, soft and tender, fading away unnoticed, as if they had never existed. I stood there for a long time, gazing at the place where she had vanished. I felt the earth beneath my feet grow firmer, the air growing clearer, and the sounds of the forest once more filling the space. Everything I had gone through seemed no more than a nightmare, from which I had emerged alive. But now I knew for sure I was free. And perhaps in this forest there would be no more fear like before. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing that this chapter of my life was over. When I returned home, I felt that the weight of those days in the Carpathians was gradually leaving me. The forest, its mysterious sounds and images, all of that was now behind me. But even in the coziest corner of my home, where I expected to find peace, something remained. A kind of emptiness inside that couldn't be filled with mere words. I told my story to my friends and colleagues, but they just couldn't believe what I had experienced.
Well, you're quite the fantasist.
One of them said, chuckling.
Mavka's forest monsters, that sounds more like a horror movie script than real life.
Another colleague, who had just returned from vacation, supported him.
Oh yes, and I'll tell you about the ghost I met in India if you want.
I felt a bitterness from their words. I had sincerely tried to share what I had gone through, but they laughed, mocking me as if I could really believe in ancient legends, in these myths, in these beings. They had no understanding of what had happened. They weren't there. They hadn't heard those sounds, seen those eyes, or felt that pressure that bore down on you the moment you stepped into those Carpathian woods. That's why I decided I would share my story here, on the forum. In truth, I hesitated for a long time about whether I should do this. The world is full of skeptics. But someone has to know the truth. Someone has to understand that myths are not always just fiction. And not everything can be explained rationally. I didn't expect people to believe me, but I believed that if even a few people approached these myths, these ancient tales that have been passed down through generations, with caution, then I wouldn't have shared this in vain. Now, as I wrote this story, I felt the same weight on my soul. But it wasn't the bitterness of not being believed. It was the knowledge that I had done all I could. I told the truth. Not long ago, I dug up that ancient amulet I found in that battered backpack when I was in the Carpathians. I took it with me. When I discovered that it may have played a key role in my survival, I felt that its purpose was to be with the one who needed it. Now the amulet rests on my shelf, among other souvenirs that remind me of travels and adventures. It has become a part of my life, a reminder that this world is full of unexplored mysteries and dangers. But it has also become something like a talisman for me. Sometimes when I look at it, I realize that it doesn't matter what we believe or don't believe. What matters is that our faith in ourselves and in reason is with us in the most terrifying moments. Time has passed, but I still cannot forget that girl in the forest. That moment when her gaze found peace. And despite the fact that she disappeared, I know one thing. I will forever carry this memory with me. This encounter with a being who has already gone. A Mavka. A soul that may have been doomed to eternal wandering until it met the one who could help it find peace. I'm not sure if I fully believe in it, but one thing I can say for certain, it was real. And now, every time I remember that forest and her eyes, I know, sometimes myths are much more real than we think.
Stories may end, but the fear remains. Subscribe to uncover more secrets hidden in the darkness. Until we meet again in the world of nightmarish shadows.